Hey y'all. I thought I'd make a video with another slideshow. This is from a talk I gave last August. It's about the feelings that autoheterosexuals have. And the the reason I gave this talk is s- I wanted clinicians to be able to notice indirect signs of autosexuality without having to ask about sexuality because whether due to shame or other factors, sometimes patients won't tell the truth about their experience. And so I thought it'd be really strategic if clinicians had a way of indirectly sensing the presence of autosexuality without having to ask about it in ways that can trigger a socially appropriate response style. Yeah. And so, just for those who don't know, in case don't know who I am, um, I wrote a book about autoheterosexuality. It's sometimes people's heterosexuality gets turned inward and directed towards themselves, and it makes them like attracted to being the other sex. And it'll make them want to be whatever l- their conception is of the other sex, or like what's attractive in it about it. They will want to be that, and this sexual orientation will make them get attached to that over time, and often it leads to gender dysphoria and cross gender identity. When females experience autoheterosexuality, it's called autoandrophilia, for love of self as man. That's a sexual attraction to being a man. And when males have autoheterosexuality, it's called autogynephilia, love of self as woman. It's a sexual attraction to being a woman. And so I'm a fan of the umbrella term autoheterosexuality to cover both of these under a shared heading. It's basically analogous to how homosexuals have a term that puts gay men and lesbians under the same heading. And obviously, gay men and lesbians are different, but it's useful to have a term for the same sex attraction trait that they share in common. And so autoheterosexuality is just cross gender attraction when you're attracted to being the other gender. Um, yeah, like I said, this sort of talk is to help you indirectly spot signs of autoheterosexuality. If you're a clinician, it's really important to know that there are multiple discrete types of gender dysphoria. That gender dysphoria is not one thing. There is a homosexual type of gender dysphoria which arises in both sexes. Um, this fact is pretty non-controversial among sexologists, and it's pretty well accepted that some gay men are so feminine that due to that inborn cross-gender proclivity, as well as say whatever society they're in, they may decide that living as the other sex is more feasible, and so they'll transition to be women. And inversely, when the female to male transsexualism of homosexual ideology, some lesbians are born so masculine that and this creates social problems for them and identity issues. And by transitioning to live as men, it can help ameliorate some of these issues they're facing. So the homosexual type is sort of the classical image of transsexualism, but that's not what this talk is about. I'm talking about the autoheterosexual kind. And there's also, I think the autoheterosexual kind occurs in both sexes. It's there's sort of a dispute between me and other people that are sexologists who think that females can't have autoandrophilia or that it's not analogous to male autogynephilia, but I'm pretty confident it is. Um, and I've seen enough cases of females reporting cross-gender eroticism. Um, yeah, I guess I don't have to go into the specifics of that. You can look at my other video on female, basically me making the case that female autoandrophilia exists. Um, There's also a third type that's been proposed of gender dysphoria, a rapid onset gender dysphoria, which is when someone reports gender dysphoria seemingly out of nowhere. As a child, they were not gender nonconforming, but then during puberty or in adolescence, all of a sudden they come out as trans or say that they have gender dysphoria, and this catches their family and friends by surprise. And this is being called rapid onset gender dysphoria. There's been a couple studies on it, but yeah, for both autoheterosexuality, or rather for female autoandrophilia and for rapid onset gender dysphoria, there hasn't been as big of a body of research as there is for male autogynephilia, which is perhaps the most established, well evidenced type of gender variance, and then also the homosexual type that's very firmly established as well. There's when it comes to autoheterosexuality, the different like men and women differ in their bodies, their bodily functions, their clothing, their social roles, and how they're treated socially, the way they behave, and also the way they think and feel. And since men and women tend to differ in these ways, autoheterosexuals are attracted to embodying the other gender through these various avenues, whether it's through changing their body, through transsexualism, through wearing the clothes associated with the other sex, commonly called transvestism, and or through social transition, which would tap into the interpersonal social aspect of cross gender embodiment. They may also choose to behave like along the lines of their conception of the other sex or gender. And um, I think that there's also a sixth sort of aspect of gender embodiment of consciousness embodiment of mind, of thoughts and feelings. I think this one also exists. The first five I mentioned have been established for autogynephilia. So for me to be applying it to both autoandrophilia and autogynephilia here is, it's tentative. It's going beyond what the published research says, but it's my observation that these same things can occur among autoandrophilic females. And yeah, and I refer to this idea of cross gender embodiment, or sometimes just cross embodiment, when it's a way of referring to being the other gender or being more like it. Um, and yeah, like I said, there's these different aspects of gendered embodiment, and the autoheterosexuals will want to embody the other one through these various avenues. And each individual has different categories that they consider interesting or important to them. There's a lot of variation within the populations. So when an autoheterosexual has a sense of attaining cross-gender embodiment, um, they can feel positive feelings called gender euphoria that occur in response to them. Inversely, if they perceive a shortcoming of cross-gender embodiment, like say like an autoandrophilic female wants, say like they want to be taller than they are, but then they're like a foot shorter than they actually want to be. Like say they're 5 foot tall and they want to be 6 foot tall, they can feel gender dysphoria about their height because they haven't attained the desired height, which they see as desirable. The the authoritatively titled Gender Dysphoria Bible. It says that anything that can be a source of dysphoria has an equal and opposite euphoria. It's almost like one of Newton's laws of motion, but for gender feelings. And I think this is true. That's something the Gender Dysphoria Bible got right. Um, and Hirschfeld wrote in a more lengthy sense. He wrote something pertaining to clothing that captures the same idea. And this originally written in German, but translated into English by Michael Lombardi Nash. It says, "In the apparel of their own sex, they feel confined, bound up, oppressed. They perceive them as something strange, something that does not fit them, does not belong to them. On the other hand, they cannot find enough words to describe the feeling of peace, security, and exaltation, happiness, and well being that overcomes them when in the clothing of the other sex." And so, yeah, that quote is, it shows the bad gender feelings related to the clothes they have to wear. And then it shows, on the other hand, there's the good feelings related to the clothes they wear, which is what you'd expect if that statement from the Gender Dysphoria Bible is correct. So with gender euphoria, I've noticed a lot of themes in gender euphoria narratives. At least initially, it's often like an excitement or a joy, and there can actually be a very tangible physical rush that goes through the body for some of the first time someone is exposed to a particular type of stimulus. Um, and over time, these feelings tend to transition into being um, more of a feeling of connection or rightness, or feeling of like wholeness or completeness, calmness or contentment, or like safety, peace, and serenity. I've noticed these themes in quite a few narratives, and so we're going to go through some short little excerpts now, see some examples. One of the narratives collected by Anne Lawrence said, "Those feelings which I felt whenever I was with a group of girls my age are the same feelings that other people, heterosexuals and homosexuals, talk about. Love, sexual excitement, and everything else that goes with it. It goes far beyond sex, though. It's about a feeling of connectedness and of rightness. For lack of a better word, it's like being in love." And that was written by an autogynephilic transsexual, like a trans woman who had transitioned. I'm also gonna quote some excerpts from Will Bichel's gender euphoria research. I hope I'm pronouncing his last name right. Apologies, Will, if you see this and I'm not pronouncing it right. Um, he did a really insightful um, thesis on gender euphoria, and there's been a paper that's been published with it, that part of some of like the greatest hits from it. And I'll put the links to these papers down in the description so you guys can check it out. Um, this diagram is probably too small to show up on your screen, but anyways, this is one of the diagrams from his thesis. Um, he ranked the forms of gendered embodiment from most internal to most external, and the really striking thing to me about this diagram is the red and the blue sections in it. These categories in there map very neatly onto the known types of autogynephilia that exist. Um, with So starting from the bottom, that he he noticed that people feel gender pleasure with regards to their mind, which, okay, that's not one of the that's one of the subtypes that I'm proposing exists. That one's not really demonstrated yet. I call it psyche autogynephilia or psyche autoheterosexuality. It's about having like a cross gender mindset. But as you go outward from there, there's body composition, bodily actions, which is behavior, and body adornments. And so body compositions, that's anatomic, bodily actions, that's behavior, bodily adornments, that's sartorial or transvestic, whatever you want to call it. But all these interpersonal subtypes listed here, or intrapersonal rather, all of them map onto types subtypes of autosexual gendered embodiment. And then he also lists outward that in that blue section in this diagram, there's a interpersonal, and that's also one of the subtypes. And with autoheterosexuality, interpersonal um, autoheterosexuality, it can make someone like care about what pronouns they get gendered with, like how they're treated in social situations. It can also, like in a sexual context, it can create a secondary sexual, like a gender affirming same sex attraction called meta attraction, where, say, like, an autogynephilic male will be attracted to playing a feminine sex role in relation to a man, and an androphilic female can be attracted to playing a manly sex role with a female. And this diagram also goes outward to the institutional and societal level. Um, I'm unsure of like whether that is a separate category or whether that kind of broadly counts as interpersonal. I'm not quite sure. But I just wanted to include this diagram because I thought it's really uncanny how um, someone who, based on the sources they cite, it doesn't seem like he's really dived deeply into the autogynephilia research, but he sort of independently noticed basically the same categories of gendered embodiment interest that are mentioned in some of the autogynephilia research. So I thought that was really interesting that an outside observer, so to speak, is noticing the same things, which I think lends further credence to the reality of them. So in Will Beichel's paper, he has some quotes, some short little quotes from some interviews he did uh, about people describing gender euphoria. For instance, one said it's sheer joy and contentment. Another said it's a moment of elation or connection with one's gender. One trans mask said, "Wow, I'm hot," which understandable. That if potentially autoandrophilia is behind this, of course, attractiveness would be relevant. Um, Another said it was the electric feeling of happiness and excitement in expressing one's gender. And transgender women's described it as a breath of fresh air, which sort of speaks to the sense of like relief and comfort and wholeness in oneself upon being in touch with their target gender. Gender euphoria is initially intense with exposure to particular types of stimuli, say, like the first time someone gets gendered a particular way, or the first time they see themselves as the other gender in the mirror, or the first time they cross dress, or first time they bind their breasts, or first time they wear a packer. The first time you do something, it typically tends to be a much stronger response emotionally and perhaps even physiologically than later on once you get accustomed to it, which is pretty normal for humans to have some sort of hedonic adaptation like this. And this is also seen with sexuality and romance, where someone gets like incredibly nervously excited, like when they're um, first dating someone or first interested in someone. But then if they've been dating them like 3 or 4 years, it's like more of a comfort thing and a feeling of rightness and a deeper connection. And that same sort of development of gender feelings seems to happen here with autoheterosexuality. One of the trans men in Beichel's research said that the first time I wore a packer, I slipped a rolled sock into my boxer briefs and cried because it felt so right. Similarly, one of the transsexuals um, that and Lawrence collected narratives from, she said, "When I put on the dress for the first time, after I let myself relax for a few minutes, I started to cry and felt very safe and at peace. I'm not sure what to make of this." So again, it's at first it's so intense that it led to crying, and it's like if for people that don't have these sort of autosexual orientations, it can seem strange that someone would have such strong feelings about doing such things, but I mean, I felt these feelings before, I get it. This is if you understand that this is connected to romance and sexuality, it's really not surprising. Um, our the, like, romantic part of our psychology has tremendous sway over our emotions. Um, I think there's a couple slides here that were also included in my, that other video I did on female autoandrophilia. So, here's some examples of there's plenty of examples on the FTM subreddit of them discussing, like, what's the strangest thing you ever got gender euphoria from. Hundreds of examples. these are some of my favorite Reddit threads. If any of you have not looked at Strange Euphoria threads on the FTM subreddit, just go to that subreddit, type in the word euphoria, scroll down till you see a thread about weird euphoria that has hundreds of comments, and just start reading. It's pretty good. Um, some common themes in these gender euphoria posts are the and I have them separated based on the aspect of gendered embodiment here, whether it's behavioral, interpersonal, or clothing, or about anatomy. Um, yeah, like I said in the other video, some of the FTM gender euphoria posts talk about getting euphoria from doing man stuff like heavy lifting, opening jars, man spreading, or doing yard work, grilling. Quite a few really like grilling or being a handyman. Um, I also like interpersonal embodiment in the sense of being handed the check at a restaurant or having animals react to them as though they're men, or being called sir or getting the head nod from other men. Um, or I've noticed also in particular, men's hygiene products are brought up quite frequently in these strange euphoria threads, like a lot. Some of them talk, yeah, they like either like cologne or like really over the top stuff like Axe. Um, but yeah, they'll like those hygiene products or wearing boxers or wearing shorts in the winter can give them gender euphoria. And some of them have gotten gender euphoria from their body hair, facial hair, or hand veins, and these are the sort of things that'll start happening, after going on testosterone. Um, some if you're curious about if you're like a clinician who has gender patients or, you're just someone that's friends with trans people and you're curious about their gender euphoria, you can ask about it. Um, you can ask them if they've ever experienced it, and if so, like, what does it feel like, and ask them to describe it. You can ask what kind of situations they feel it from, um, and these will give you a clue about the aspects of gendered embodiment that matter to them, because they're having a strong emotional reaction to these types of stimuli, which indicates that these are the types of stimuli that are part of their autosexuality. And you can also ask them how often they feel gender euphoria or like what's the most intense gender euphoria you've ever felt. I have a hunch that if you ask about the most intense gender euphoria, it's a good chance they'll say something along the lines of it was their first time packing or first time binding or something like that. Um, yeah, there's now for the bummer part. The euphoria is fun, dysphoria is not so fun. But anyways, with autosexual gender dysphoria, there can be dissociation or alienation, disconnection from the body, sort of depersonalization, derealization, those sort of things. This internal disconnection. Um, they can also have gender envy, depression, like sort of anhedonia or lack of meaning. Let's go into these more specifically now. Um, in one qualitative study of gender dysphoria, a trans woman described it like a gut punch, a visceral feeling of alienation and being misunderstood. A trans man in that same study said, I see a cis man, assumed cis, or a very masculine person interacting with others, and I feel insecure and unconfident, sometimes even panicked, anxious, or dissociative. One quote from Hirschfeld's book, Case 3, in his transvestites. I really, this quote is so good. Um, It says, my yearning is not limited to women's costumes, but also extends itself to an absolute life as a woman with all primary and secondary phenomena. And to be sure, this desire is so intensive and irrepressible in me that the inability to fulfill it brings me into conflict with life and takes away my happiness. Um, so gender envy. Um, Gender envy also comes up, um, and when it does, it often raises the do be question, which is like, do I want to do them or be them? Like if they see an attractive person of the other sex, they'll feel this confusing mixture of like attraction and envy. They won't be like this happens quite a bit for autogynephiles and autoandrophiles, where they'll see someone that the other sex is really attractive and that person's strangely compelling to them, but they can't sure whether they're like attracted to them or they want to be them. Um, and of course, this makes sense when you understand that these feelings are being they're a byproduct of heterosexuality that is pointing in both directions. They have both an externally pointing heterosexuality and an internally pointing heterosexuality that makes them want to be the other gender. And these two can kind of like conflict and happen at the same time, and that tension can be quite confusing. And with gender envy, if like the cross genderedness, if it's a transgender person of their same sex, um, that's especially likely to trigger envy. There's sort of like a sense that because it's actually possible to transition, like you can't become the other sex, but you can transition, and there's like a tangible realness to it that can make the gender envy cut especially deep when it's with respect to another transgender person. And you can see this online when you see say like the way trans women interact with each other. They're like whichever one say there's like a trans woman that passes really well, is particularly attractive. The other ones will often be quite envious and like try to tear her down, or they'll just like feel really bad. They'll just feel terrible because of like how they look comparatively masculine in relation to this trans woman. Um, and there's some anecdotes, some excerpts from Eonism by Havelock Ellis. Um, RM, one of the narratives in there. She said, "I could not look at a pretty girl without envying her, her beauty and her womanhood, and would gladly have changed places with almost any woman from 15 to 45 who was in the least attractive to me." Notice how attractiveness is quite relevant here. She doesn't want to become like a 70-year-old woman. It's someone in basically reproductively viable age, which is what you'd expect if these feelings are caused by internalized heterosexuality. RL from Eonism, she said she had really bad gender envy, really bad. And she also felt it for female impersonators that she saw. She would go to these shows, see female impersonators, then feel intense envy and leave the show feeling completely crappy, but then she'd still go back and see more. She said, "I was feeling miserable and frequently suffering real pain, for the sight of a well dressed woman would often cause me to clench my nails into my palms, suppress a groan, sometimes a swear escaping my lips." Um, now, now talk for dissociation. Um, as I mentioned, autosexuals sometimes feel dissociated from themselves. Because with autoheterosexuality, their brain is kind of like looking for the cross gender self within themselves. And so when they can't find that, they can sometimes feel like they don't even exist, or that there's like their mind is separate from their body. Um, and Elliot Page seems to have had this. Um, he said that 11 was when I last felt present in my flesh, not suspended above, transient and frantic to return. It was a departure of sorts, a path to a false identity in a shell of a disguise. He also wrote, "I had to avoid my reflection. I couldn't look at pictures because I was never there. It was making me sick. I didn't want to be here. I wanted to be lifted out. The gender dysphoria slowly crushing me." And so you see here, like, he can see himself in a mirror or reflection, but then he doesn't have the recognition that that's me. Like before he transitioned, he would see a woman looking back, and he just wouldn't. It just wouldn't connect that that was him. It was like not relevant almost. Um, As I mentioned, you can also have depression or anhedonia as a byproduct of autosexual dysphoria. kind of like some of these quotes from transvestites really capture the feeling pretty well. Um, One transvestite said, "When I stop cross dressing, and I've often tried to give it up, it's as if my entire world turns gray. The joy and happiness that I usually get from many activities is reduced. The peaks of satisfaction and pleasure are gone." Hirschfeld, describing his transvestite patients and perhaps sexual minorities more broadly, said that sexually abnormal persons who are forced into a lifestyle that stands opposed to their nature often thereby fall into depressed mental states that at times even lead to suicide. And this kind of makes sense. Our sexual orientations, they have a big impact on our emotional well-being. Like for example, um, even among heterosexuals, if they are if they really want to have a girlfriend or a boyfriend and get married and all that, but they're having trouble finding a partner, um, and they're just like celibate, they can often feel quite depressed and despondent because they have this really core need pertaining to their psychology that is not being met, and then they can feel really crappy as a result. And yeah, because sexual orientations, they often impart a sense of meaning in our lives. They give us meaning and direction. So with autoheterosexuality, being the other gender really matters, and autoheterosexuals who can't embody the other gender to their satisfaction, they can sometimes feel that life is meaningless and pointless. Lou Sullivan got to this point um, a year or two before he started transitioning. He wrote in his diaries, "Sitting in my apartment, crying because I feel so goddamn empty inside. My whole goddamn life is a waste of time, just trying to think up things to do to waste time until I die. Nothing means a goddamn thing." I'm laughing because not because I'm happy that he was sad, but I find him so likable. Um, yeah, his diaries are great. I recommend reading them if you're interested in autoandrophilia or just transmasculine psychology or just Lou Sullivan. He's a really interesting guy. He also said in his diary, "If I am ever going to do anything with my life that I can be proud of, it must be my success at living life as a young man." And in the way that he used the term young man, it often meant like a young homosexual man. He wanted to be a very attractive gay man. And I'm also gonna mention shame here because even though it's not gender dysphoria, it's still important. Um, Auto-heterosexuals can feel shame about their sexual arousal that they might have experienced in response to cross-gender embodiment, whether that's cross-dressing or fantasies or whatever. They can also feel shame around not passing well enough as the other gender. If they're transitioning, they can feel that they're failing, they're coming up short, and not succeeding at something that really matters to them, and they can feel ashamed about that. Likewise, they can also, if they're not transitioning and don't want to, they can also feel shame from their inability to live up to the gender role expectations of their birth sex. So yeah, whether it's shame due to sexuality or shame due to your ability to adhere to gender norms, autoheterosexuals can seem to have shame related to their predisposition. Um, so inauthenticity comes up where, as with autosexual trans identity formation, it can get to a point where you feel as though you're kind of like just going through the motions in life, like an empty husk, and that you almost have like a mask on, and people can't see the real you, and they're just seeing a fake, inferior version of you, and you really want to live as the other gender, and the inability to do that can leave them feeling inauthentic. RL said that my real life has had to be subjected to my physical self, my body. And here you see, yeah, her female self was the dominant part of her self system, and she saw her body as like an appalling obstruction that was stopping her from living as her real self. One of Hirschfeld's transvestites, she was a lawyer. She was very smart. I recommend reading Hirschfeld's book if you haven't. Um, she said, putting on women's underclothing in no way calls up sexual stimulation, but rather gratifies me insofar as the feeling in my soul is given external expression. Um, and yeah, that thing that she's describing of the feeling in my soul and giving it external expression. That's again feeling like the real part is inside, and this like outer facade is covering up the real authentic you. Um, this is probably just associated with the I bet a lot of people that feel this way also have the dissociation I was mentioning earlier, that split between mind and body. There's the authenticity seems to be related to that internal split. With autoheterosexuals, their sentiments are pretty predictable about gender, and these tend to grow over time. The other gender is good or better. The birth gender is bad or worse. Hirschfeld described this quite well when noting about his male to female transvestites that everything about the body that recalls masculinity is perceived with distaste. Everything, absolutely everything that signifies femininity is craved. And that's it in a nutshell. That any when when you have developed erotic target identity inversion, this sort of invert this when you have these autosexual attractions, they can build up this cross gender self and sort of invert your sense of identity and your priorities in life. It can invert a whole lot of things, and it generally ends up making you think that you put that other gender like on a pedestal. Like if you're autogynephilic and you have your sentiments shifted drastically by your autogynephilia, women are just amazing, completely beautiful. They can do no wrong. They're just the best. You wish the whole world was almost completely women. Um, they're just the best. You want women everywhere. Inversely, when you have this, you just think that men are the worst. Maleness is just awful. Men are so like violent, stinky, and crude. They're just awful, filthy beasts. Just absolutely undignified. It's like undignified to actually have to be male. Like that's sort of like how someone that has um like autogynephilic identity inversion, they might feel about gender at that point. For instance, like a lot of trans women, they refer to the physical changes that occurred in their body due to their natal puberty as testosterone poisoning. And yeah, that sentiment is quite super common among autogynephilic trans women online, which it's the majority of trans women. They'll talk about testosterone poisoning, and this is because of their sentiments about how they feel about gendered traits at that point. They're obviously not actually being literally poisoned. It's almost like a spiritual poisoning that the what could have been pure and good and feminine is being spoiled by the crudeness of masculinity. And yeah, just sort of like conclude here. Autoheterosexuals, they have strong feelings about their gendered embodiment. This is understandable. Gender euphoria is when they get the warm, fuzzy feelings in response to perceiving that they're being like the other gender or sex. Gender dysphoria is the inverse. It's negative feelings in response to perceived shortcomings of being the other sex or gender. And the avenues they take to embody the other gender, there's quite a few of them. This can be with regards to anatomy, bodily functions, clothing, social role, behavior, or their mindset. And um, like I said, the sort of aspects of gendered embodiment that an auto heterosexual person focuses on, it's likely indicative of sort of like how their orientation expresses itself or like what their priorities are in that respect. And this is really important information because so if you're a clinician doing a gatekeeping role and you're trying to decide, hey, does this is this patient a good candidate for transsexualism, like for hormones and surgeries? If you have like say you have an autogynephilic patient that only they don't care about the clothing or how anyone sees them, they it just pains them to have a masculine body and they just want the physical body. They don't care about anything else. They don't care if anyone sees them as a woman. They just want the body. Then someone like that is probably a much better candidate. It's probably a pretty good candidate for gender transition because transsexualism changes the body to be more like the other sex. Like it is directly giving them what they want, right? Whereas if you had a patient who is didn't care about the body or, like, how anyone saw them. They really liked wearing women's clothing and, like, acting ladylike, but they didn't care about how anyone saw them or care much about the masculinity of their body, then someone like that is not as obvious of a candidate for medical transition because what is the point in changing their body if they don't care about that and they just want it so the clothes look better or, you know? So if yeah, it really depends on, I'd say the types of forms of gendered embodiment that they have, like, that'll give you insight into sort of the path forward for them in terms of how they can live an enjoyable, satisfactory life. And, I think gender euphoria is really has a lot of potential, um, say, like, in a diagnostic situation where if you have someone that's coming to you with gender issues and they you don't know what type they have, like, is this homosexual gender issues or autosexual gender issues or perhaps rapid onset gender dysphoria? Um, like, which type do they have? If you ask them about gender euphoria and they tell you about various forms of cross-gender embodiment, such as dressing or behaving like the other sex or having people use the particular pronouns trigger gender euphoria, like, if they ever were brought to tears by gender euphoria, that to me, that seems like a pretty strong indicator of that it's likely autosexuality that is sort of genre of gender issues that they have. So yeah, I think this information is important. Um, I think it can be useful, like I said, for clinicians. Obviously, it can be useful because it can avoid. You don't even have to ask about sexuality. You can just ask about their other gender feelings and then their gender euphoria experiences and sort of intuit um, like which aspects of the orientation they have most strongly without having to directly ask about sex stuff. And this information can I think it can also be useful for, say, like, just if you're just autogynephilic or autoandrophilic and you're trying to figure out your own gender situation without any help from a clinician, just introspecting. It's having these sort of, understanding that there's different aspects of gendered embodiment and whether it's clothing and body and such, and that some of these may be, um best addressed through medical things. Some may be best addressed through cross dressing or through say, like role playing as a girl online or whatever. Um, it can just be helpful to conceptually break down gender embodiment into these various aspects and also better understand gender euphoria and gender dysphoria. And because these days clinicians aren't doing they're like not being allowed to do their jobs a lot of the time. Like their role as gatekeeper, and so people have to be increasingly people have to be their own gatekeepers. And since that is the case, I think it's really important to have information out there so that people that are considering transition can sort of perform the role of being their own gatekeeper because they're the only one left to do it at this point a lot of times. Um, yeah, so that's the gist I wanted to talk about. Um, if you're interested in autoandrophilia, I just uploaded a video um, with me going through a similar presentation that's about sort of the case for autoandrophilia and its existence and various ways it manifests and sort of like how we can infer that it exists, both in terms of obvious things like females reporting sexual interest in being male, and then also the downstream effects such as or like phenomenological experience such as gender euphoria or phantom anatomy, um, things like that. So yeah, and if you want to understand stuff in more depth, I wrote a book called Autoheterosexual: Attracted to Being the Other Sex. It explains female autoandrophilia, male autogynephilia. It does this in it's for a general audience, so it is for my people. I wrote it for my own kind so that they could figure out what's happening to them, learn about it in a morally neutral way. It doesn't condemn them at all. It doesn't say they're gross or bad. 'Cause it's just a sexual minority orientation, and it's it's fine to be this thing, and so, yeah, I wrote Autoheterosexuals so that my kind could figure out their gender issues without sort of, like, the bullshit that the trans movement or the gender criticals, like, either of those 2 groups, they're they're very politically oriented, and they're not doing good at helping people with gender issues actually understand their situation objectively. And I wrote the book to explain that. And yeah, and I just explained these feelings now so that if you have them, you can sort of maybe have better be able to put language to it and introspect through your gender feelings and chart your gender destiny, whatever you decide that will be. Um, yeah, thanks for listening. Um, Please like and subscribe, etc. You know the things that YouTubers say. Feel free to share this video on various trans subreddits. I'm sure that'll go over and people won't get that'll go over great and people won't get mad at all. Go for it. Please try sharing that. Yeah. Bye.